What you are about to hear is not a story about a car. It is a story about the day an entire nation held its breath, the day the impossible happened in the French countryside, and the day a machine that almost every engineer on the planet had laughed at for 30 straight years let out a scream that silenced every single one of them forever. Stay until the end, because the ending of this story is so cruel, so unfair, and so perfectly poetic that you will not believe it actually happened in real life. This is the story of the Mazda 787B, the only Japanese car, the only rotary engine car, and the only car of its kind to ever win the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the strange twist of fate that crashed down on it the very moment it crossed that finish line. It is the early hours of a Sunday morning in June 1991, deep in the French countryside, on a stretch of public road that for 1 week a year becomes the most dangerous and most prestigious racetrack on planet Earth. Fog still clings low to the tarmac. Tens of thousands of fans have been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and the smell of burning rubber. But on the other side of the planet, in Japan, it is already evening, and something strange is happening. Television sets across the entire country are tuned to the exact same channel. Office workers are crowded around tiny screens. Families sit in silence in their living rooms. An entire nation, for the first time in its history, is collectively holding its breath over a car race happening 8,000 kilometers away, because somehow, against every prediction, against decades of humiliating failure, a strange, screaming, orange and green Japanese race car is leading the most brutal endurance race on the planet, and it is about to do something that should be mechanically and historically impossible. This is not a story about winners. Let's get that straight right now. This is a story about losers. About a team that failed so many times, so spectacularly, and so publicly, that by all logic, they should have given up a decade earlier. This is the story of how a group of underdogs, outcasts, a literal prisoner, a rookie, and a man doctors swore would never race again, took an engine that the entire automotive world considered a joke, a gimmick, a toy, and used it to humiliate Porsche, humble Jaguar, and outrun Mercedes, only for the sport's rulemakers to turn around and ban that very engine almost the second the celebrations died down. If you think you know this story because you've seen a few clips of a screaming orange Mazda online, trust me, you don't know the half of it. Buckle up. To understand why this victory was so insane, you have to go all the way back to the 1960s to a small, relatively unknown Japanese car company that nobody outside of Japan really took seriously. Mazda was not Toyota. It was not Honda. What Mazda did have was a strange, almost reckless obsession with an engine design that virtually no other car company on Earth wanted anything to do with. It was called the rotary engine, designed originally by a German engineer named Felix Wankel. Instead of pistons moving up and down in a straight line, the rotary engine used a triangular rotor spinning smoothly inside an oval housing. It was lighter, smaller, revved incredibly fast, and produced a sound unlike anything else on four wheels, a high-pitched, almost otherworldly scream that sounded more like a jet fighter than a car. On paper, it sounded like the engine of the future. In reality, it was a nightmare to perfect. The seals on the rotor tips wore out fast. Fuel economy was terrible. Engineers all over the world tried the rotary concept, ran into the same brutal list of problems, and quietly abandoned it for safe, reliable, boring pistons. Mazda was different. Mazda was stubborn. While every other manufacturer walked away, Mazda doubled down, pouring decades of resources and company pride into proving this misunderstood little engine could actually be great. For a very long time, the results were humiliating. Mazda's first attempts at endurance racing were nothing short of disastrous. Their early touring car efforts didn't even sniff the podium. Their promising prototype, the MC74, broke down before finishing a race. The RX-7 they brought to Le Mans didn't even qualify. Year after year, Mazda would show up, get demolished by the European manufacturers, limp home with a broken engine or blown gearbox, and quietly go back to the drawing board. There was one small flicker of hope in 1984, when a Mazda-powered car won a race, but it was in a slower, less prestigious class, and frankly, nobody really cared. The dream of an overall Le Mans win felt like exactly that, a dream. The kind of fantasy engineers tell themselves to keep believing in a project everyone else has written off. Then, things got even worse. The follow-up cars, the 757, the 767, the 767B, all came to Le Mans and all got crushed by the competition. By 1990, things looked genuinely bleak. Mazda's newest prototype, the 787, debuted with a brand new four-rotor engine called the R26B, replacing the older two-rotor 13B. It was supposed to be the turning point. On a cold morning in 1990, both 787 race cars failed to even finish. One suffered engine trouble. The other simply caught fire and gave up entirely, smoke pouring out in front of a global television audience. For an engine fighting for legitimacy for almost 3 decades, watching it literally burst into flames felt like the final nail in the coffin. And there was a ticking clock hanging over the entire project that almost nobody outside the paddock fully understood yet. You see, in racing, there are really only 3 things that decide who wins and loses: the car, the driver, and the rules. Heading into the early 1990s, the rules were about to change in a way that would doom the rotary engine forever. Cars in the 1980s had become absurdly fast, and the FIA, the governing body in charge of Le Mans, decided it was time to rein things in. Starting with the 1992 season, every prototype would be required to use a standard naturally aspirated engine of no more than 3.5 liters, forcing manufacturers to align with Formula One regulations. All the wild, creative, experimental engine designs of the 1980s were about to be legislated out of existence. Now, you might have heard the popular myth that the 787B was banned because it was too loud or too fast for the rule makers to handle. Track officials genuinely did warn spectators ahead of time that the car was extraordinarily loud enough that people needed to cover their ears as it screamed past. But the real reason had nothing to do with noise or speed. It came down to something far more boring and bureaucratic: a simple rulebook change designed to standardize engine regulations. Mazda knew that 1991 was their last chance to prove the rotary engine was a legitimate, world-class racing platform before the rulebook erased it forever. So, with their backs against the wall and nothing left to lose, Mazda's engineers went back to the workshop and built something that genuinely had never existed before. The man behind the chassis design was Nigel Stroud, a British engineer who had previously worked on the legendary Porsche 956 and cut his teeth in Formula One. Stroud convinced Mazda's racing division to spend serious money on a full carbon fiber monocoque with a body shape refined in a wind tunnel to maximize top speed down the terrifyingly fast Mulsanne Straight. The car had carbon ceramic brakes, an absolute revolution for the time. But the real star of the show was the completely revised four-rotor R26B engine sitting behind the driver's seat. This new version of the engine featured ceramic apex seals to finally solve the durability problems that had plagued rotary engines for decades, 3 spark plugs per rotor for a cleaner combustion cycle, and a genuinely revolutionary continuously variable intake system that kept the engine in its power band almost the entire time it ran. Like a permanently active version of VTEC on an entirely different scale. The result was an engine capable of producing nearly 900 horsepower almost instantly. Mazda then deliberately detuned it down to around 700 horsepower, sacrificing outright power for reliability and fuel efficiency. Because this wasn't a sprint, it was 24 hours of pure, relentless punishment. And in endurance racing, the car that finishes is always faster than the car that doesn't. I know it sounds strange to talk about a rotary engine being praised for reliability, especially if your only experience with rotary-powered Mazdas is hearing horror stories about RX-7s and RX-8s blowing apex seals in a parking lot somewhere. But in 1991, in that particular car, Mazda had built arguably the most reliable, most efficient power unit on the entire grid, and it happened to be a rotary. Instead of obsessing purely over lap times, Mazda's engineers spent practice sessions training the drivers to conserve fuel while still maintaining a competitive pace. Wrapped in its now iconic orange and green renowned livery, the 787B looked, sounded, and behaved like nothing else on the grid. All that remained was finding drivers tough enough to actually tame this thing for 24 straight hours. And the drivers Mazda assembled for this mission were the kind of characters you couldn't make up if you tried. The team was technically French, spearheaded by Belgian team principal Jackie Ickx, a legendary figure who knew exactly how to manage cars and egos under extreme pressure. There were 2 separate 787B entries that year, but the story everyone remembers belongs to car number 55 and its trio of drivers: Belgium's Bertrand Gachot, Germany's Volker Weidler, and Britain's Johnny Herbert. Bertrand Gachot's road to Le Mans 1991 was, to put it mildly, unconventional. Earlier that same season, he had sprayed a London taxi driver with CS gas during a road rage incident, landing him a prison sentence. He spent several months behind bars and then climbed straight back into a race car as if nothing had happened. Volker Weidler had experience driving Porsche's legendary 962C at Le Mans, but had relatively few wins to his name. And then there was Johnny Herbert, a Formula racing veteran whose career nearly ended in 1988 when his car slammed into a barrier, nearly severing one foot and badly damaging the other. Doctors told him his racing career was over. Yet in 1989 he was back behind the wheel, still struggling to press a brake pedal properly, physically unable to run for the traditional Le Mans start, but somehow still capable of winning. A prisoner, a rookie, and a man with a permanent limp held together by surgical pins and sheer stubbornness. This was the group of so-called misfits that set out on June 22, 1991, to attempt the impossible and rewrite the entire history of motorsport. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon in France, and the 24 hours of Le Mans has just officially begun. Down at the back of the grid sits the number 55 Mazda 787B, starting from a humbling 19th place, a direct consequence of new regulations that reserve the top 10 starting spots for cars conforming to the FIA's push toward Formula One standards. The 787B, with its defiant rotary heart, did not conform, and so it was shoved to the back before the race even started, on top of a 200-kilogram weight penalty, nearly 440 pounds of extra ballast. In theory, this should have crushed Mazda's chances before the race even began. The smart money was on the number 1 Mercedes-Benz 11, driven in part by a young German driver who would go on to become one of the most dominant Formula One champions in history, Michael Schumacher. As the lights went out, the Mercedes team, weight penalty and all, immediately surged to the front. The Peugeot team, running without any penalty weight, couldn't match the pace. It looked exactly like everyone expected. The Europeans dominating, the underdogs scattered far behind, just fighting to survive. But here is where this story takes its first genuinely unbelievable turn. As night fell, sitting quietly right behind the dominant Mercedes powerhouse, completely off everyone's radar, was the number 55 Mazda, which had somehow already climbed all the way up to 4th place. Nobody, not the rival teams, not even Mazda's own management back in Japan, genuinely believed the 787B was a serious threat for the overall win. The car was seen as plucky, charming even, but ultimately a sideshow. That underestimation turned out to be one of the most consequential mistakes in the history of endurance racing. When it came time to hand out that mandatory weight penalty before the race, Jackie Ickx had actually managed to convince race officials that the Mazda's engine should be classified differently, as a smaller displacement, naturally aspirated unit. Nobody from any rival team bothered to question it, because nobody took the little screaming Japanese car seriously enough to care. They thought the whole Mazda effort was, in their words, kind of cute. As a result, the 787B left the line at a remarkably light 830 kilograms, ready to hunt down European giants lugging around nearly 1,000 kilograms of steel, carbon fiber, and arrogance. That casual dismissiveness was about to come back and bite them. As darkness settled over the Circuit de la Sarthe, something started to crack in the Mercedes camp. They simply could not shake the Mazda. Lap after lap, the screaming orange car refused to fall back, refused to break down. Then, one by one, the seemingly unstoppable Mercedes machines began falling apart. Number 31 developed gearbox issues. Number 32 ran into debris and suffered significant damage. Almost without anyone realizing it in real time, the underdog Mazda team had quietly climbed into 2nd place overall. In 1st place remained the lead Mercedes, but the team at Mazda Speed could smell blood in the water now. As the race dragged deep into the night, Jackie Ickx noticed something critical. The leading Mercedes appeared to be deliberately slowing its pace, conserving fuel, and protecting an engine pushed extremely hard for nearly a full day. Even though Ickx was usually an extremely cautious tactician, he made a decision that would change racing history. He told his team to push, and then, somewhere around the 22nd hour, pushed to its absolute limit by the screaming Mazda nipping at its heels, the leading Mercedes-Benz finally began to overheat and was forced into the pits for unscheduled repairs. In that single moment, the door swung wide open. The underdog Mazda 787B, the car nobody believed in, finally, impossibly, took the overall lead of the 24 hours of Le Mans. If you think the story is about to coast smoothly to a fairy tale ending from here, stick around. Because what happened in those final, brutal hours of the race is honestly the most insane part of this entire story, and it's something most people who only know the highlight reel version of this victory have absolutely no idea about. Throughout the back half of the race, the little underdog team from Japan that nobody gave a realistic shot at finishing in the top 10 was suddenly, impossibly, sitting in first place overall. Back in Japan, every single television channel was now broadcasting live coverage. An entire nation's attention locked onto a screaming orange car fighting for survival on the other side of the planet. To hold on to that lead, the team made a brutal decision. They had Johnny Herbert, the driver with the surgically reconstructed feet, take on a punishing double stint at the very end. By this point, he had no water left, was severely dehydrated, and his damaged ankle was in such agonizing pain he nearly passed out mid-corner at well over 180 miles an hour. He was battling nausea, exhaustion, and crushing anxiety, stretched far beyond what a human body should endure. And yet, somehow, he kept his pace. He kept pushing. The wild, screaming, 30-year underdog rotary engine had finally proven itself, almost like one last defiant middle finger aimed at the officials who had already signed its death warrant for the following season. It pushed past every rival on that circuit, its horrifying, high-pitched scream echoing across the French countryside as the number 55 Mazda 787B crossed the checkered line in first place overall. Johnny Herbert, the newly crowned Le Mans champion, was in genuinely rough shape by the time he crossed that finish line. He had to be pulled out of the cockpit and rushed into an ambulance. So completely depleted, he didn't even get to stand on the podium for the celebration of the greatest achievement of his career. But that's the brutal, beautiful nature of endurance racing, a test of machine and raw human will at once. And on that day, in June 1991, Mazda, and through Mazda, an entire nation watching from the other side of the world, passed that test in the most emphatic way imaginable, becoming the first team from Japan and the first team ever to win the 24 hours of Le Mans with a rotary engine. It was the cumulative result of decades of engineers, mechanics, and drivers absorbing loss after humiliating loss, and finally, on one single perfect day in France, turning all of that accumulated failure into pure, undeniable gold. And if the story ended right there, with the orange and green Mazda crossing the line, with the champagne spraying, with an entire country erupting into celebration, it would already be one of the greatest underdog stories in the history of motorsport. But it doesn't end there. Stick with me, because what happened next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And once you understand it, you will never look at this victory the same way again. Because here's the brutal, almost poetic irony buried at the heart of this entire story. The same regulation change that Mazda's engineers had been racing against the clock to beat, the new rule mandating standard 3.5-liter naturally aspirated engines starting in the 1992 season, didn't get reconsidered or softened after this historic, against all odds victory. If anything, it became even more firmly locked in. The rotary engine, the strange little misunderstood underdog engine that had just humiliated some of the wealthiest, most powerful automotive manufacturers on the planet in front of a global television audience, was effectively banned from the sport almost immediately afterward. Mazda had just achieved something genuinely unprecedented, the first and to this day still the only overall Le Mans victory by a Japanese manufacturer, and the first and only overall victory by a rotary-powered car in the history of the race. And the very next season, the engine that made it all possible was no longer legal to use at Le Mans at all. Think about how genuinely strange that is. Imagine spending 3 entire decades being mocked and dismissed by every serious engineer in the industry, watching every single rival abandon the very same engine concept you stubbornly kept betting on. And then, on what you know is essentially your last realistic shot before the rulebook erases your entire engineering philosophy from the sport forever, you go and build the single greatest version of that engine you have ever created. You don't just compete with it. You beat manufacturers with budgets many times the size of your entire racing program. And then, almost immediately afterward, the very same governing body that let you race turns around and legislates your engine out of existence, as if your victory was the final piece of evidence needed to justify shutting the door behind you. Some people will tell you it was simply a coincidence of timing, that the new engine regulations had already been planned well before the 1991 race even took place, and that's technically true. But it's hard to shake the feeling, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, that Mazda's humiliating victory over the European manufacturing establishment only reinforced exactly why those new rules needed to exist. A car this unconventional, this capable of upending an order dominated for decades by deep-pocketed European manufacturers, was, in a very real sense, a problem that needed solving. And the easiest way to solve it wasn't to outspend Mazda or out-engineer them fair and square. It was simply to change the rules so the engine that had just embarrassed everyone could never embarrass anyone again. Mazda, for what it's worth, didn't fight the decision. They didn't file protests or launch campaigns against the new regulations. In a strange, almost dignified way, it felt like they understood exactly what had just happened. Kenichi Yamamoto, widely considered the spiritual father of Mazda's entire rotary program, a man who had spent his whole career fighting to prove this misunderstood technology deserved respect, seemed to understand on some deeper level that the mission was now complete. The rotary engine had been validated in the most public, most undeniable way possible, beating the very best the world had to offer fair and square. And then, having proven everything it needed to prove, it was retired almost immediately afterward, not because it failed, but because it had finally, completely succeeded. There's something almost unbearably poetic about that. The 787B wasn't beaten on the racetrack by a better car or a smarter strategy. It was beaten by a rulebook, after the fact, as if the sport's own governing body couldn't quite handle the idea of a misfit Japanese rotary engine becoming the new standard everyone else had to chase. It was almost as if the car had been built for one purpose only, to win exactly once, etch its name permanently into the history books, and then disappear into legend before anyone could figure out how to consistently beat it. Today, the original 787B is treated by Mazda almost like a religious artifact, wheeled out for historic demonstrations, lovingly restored, and whenever its engine fires up in front of a crowd, that same high-pitched, almost inhuman scream echoes out exactly the way it did back in 1991, a permanent reminder of the one day the impossible, briefly, gloriously, became reality. And maybe that's exactly why this story still resonates so powerfully more than 3 decades later. Underneath all the engineering specs and the rulebook controversy, this is fundamentally a story about belief, about a company refusing to give up on an idea the rest of the industry had long since dismissed, and about a handful of drivers, an ex-convict, an unproven rookie, and a man doctors swore could never race again, somehow pushing through absolute exhaustion to deliver one of the greatest underdog performances motorsport has ever seen. And it's a reminder of an uncomfortable, almost universal truth, that sometimes when the underdog wins decisively enough, the people in charge of the rules quietly change them just to make sure it never happens again. So the next time you hear that high, screaming wail of a rotary engine, whether it's in an old grainy video clip from 1991 or idling in a parking lot somewhere today, remember what that sound actually represents. It's not just an engine, it's 30 years of failure. It's an entire nation's pride riding on a single race. It's a prisoner, a rookie, and a broken-bodied veteran somehow finding a way to push an impossible machine past its absolute limits for 24 straight hours. And it's the single greatest underdog story in the entire history of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. A story so good, so improbable, and so perfectly bittersweet that the people who run the sport made absolutely sure it could never happen again. If you made it this far, you now know the full, real story behind the most legendary screaming engine sound in motorsport history. The story that most short clips and highlight reels never bother to tell you. If this story hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment and let me know which underdog story you want told next. Because honestly, racing history is absolutely full of them. And there are so many more incredible stories like this, one just waiting to be told.